pertinent things we saw yesterday out of a leaked report in Israeli media is that Defense Minister Gallant came back from Washington, D.C. with the U.S. approval on a plan to install three Arab nations as peacekeepers in the Gaza Strip in the interim to handle the aid distribution. It's a leaked report. We don't know very many details. It sounds like from the leaks that are coming out of the War Cabinet that Prime Minister Netanyahu was resistant to this idea and that Defense Minister Gallant was the one who was suggesting this might be the only option. It does not include Saudi Arabia or Qatar. At least that's believed that those two nations are not involved. But potentially the UAE and Egypt would be two of the nations that would actually install forces on the ground into the Gaza Strip.
First of all, I want to start with events in Tel Aviv overnight where thousands of Israelis have been rallying, calling for some sort of a deal to free the hostages. Tell us what happened.
Well, this has been a constant occurrence to see the protests taking place, what's often referred to as in Hostage Square. Yesterday was different. It grew to multiple other major points in downtown Tel Aviv, over 10,000 people. It was the most people I have seen protesting on any single given night. And in the last several weeks, the fervor has picked up quite a bit. And I mean that in number of arrests that police have been pulling some of the protesters off the roads if they've attempted to block one of the main highways through town. We saw that last night as well. We're told dozens of arrests and that the police deployed water cannons. So this is certainly picking up in a different direction.
In terms of the impact of these protests and the response of the government, what has there been by way of response?
It continues, and some of these protests also take place in Jerusalem, smaller, albeit, but there was also roughly a few hundred protesters outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's residence inside Jerusalem. They are calling for elections largely, but mostly the chants and the shouts in Hebrew are for the release of the hostages, again, continued calls to get a deal done at any cost, and for the families who have been interviewed very publicly every night on Israeli television, they are incensed and very upset still that these mediators keep leaving with no deal. They, again, want to see whatever it takes, the release of however many Palestinian prisoners it takes to get this deal done. But again, it sounds like that red line still, as the delegation had last left Doha, was the full withdrawal of forces from the Gaza Strip. That's something Hamas is apparently unwilling to negotiate on.
Talks on a ceasefire continue, we understand, in Egypt as well, in Cairo later today. This follows the foreign ministers of Egypt, France and Jordan calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all captives held by Hamas. I mean, these talks have been ongoing, basically on an ongoing basis, haven't they, Zach? And we still haven't had much of a breakthrough, it would seem.
Yeah, and it seemed like this last week there might have been some movement because apparently Prime Minister Netanyahu gave the delegation more wiggle room on the Palestinian prisoner element of the deal, up to 100 of those to be released in this deal. For 40 hostages were tried in Israeli courts for killing Israelis. So that was certainly a large step that they took. But again, still they left with no deal. So actually, one of the more pertinent things we saw yesterday out of a leaked report in Israeli media is that Defense Minister Gallant came back from Washington, D.C. with the U.S. approval on a plan to install three Arab nations as peacekeepers in the Gaza Strip in the interim to handle the aid distribution. It's a leaked report. We don't know very many details. It sounds like from the leaks that are coming out of the War Cabinet that Prime Minister Netanyahu was resistant to this idea and that Defense Minister Gallant was the one who was suggesting this might be the only option. It does not include Saudi Arabia or Qatar. At least that's believed that those two nations are not involved. But potentially the UAE and Egypt would be two of the nations that would actually install forces on the ground into the Gaza Strip. And again, these are early reports, but what that looks like, having these nations install their forces into an active conflict zone, big question marks there.
Yeah, interesting that you mention sort of helping with the distribution of aid. We mentioned the second shipment leaving Cyprus overnight, 400 tons of food on the way. How do we understand how aid is, what effect it is having in Gaza? Is distribution working? Is it getting to people who need it?
It's working better in the south, and the Israeli administration that governs the Gaza Strip right now releases a lot of pictures and imagery of markets filled with fresh fruit and food, and they say, "See, we're doing everything we can to bring aid into the Gaza Strip." And that's only telling half the story, because in the north, in Gaza City, and anything north of Gaza City, that aid is being driven by truck and then released at just a few distribution points. And one of those distribution points yesterday, the Palestinian Red Crescent says that 5 people were killed. Dozens were wounded by gunfire in a stampede, that 3 of the 5 killed were actually shot. They say Israeli troops were nearby and involved in the shooting. The IDF claims they had no record of this incident as it's being described. The aid is being distributed right now by Gazans themselves. So the trucks are being given to Gazan drivers and then armed men that are apparently not affiliated with Hamas, the Israelis say, are responsible for keeping the crowds at bay. But we saw thousands of people at this roundabout in Gaza City, the Kuwait roundabout, which Hamas claims back on March 23rd, 19 people were killed and 23 injured at an aid distribution point in this roundabout as well. So this, again, is all against a backdrop where the aid reaching the north is having the most difficult time. That's where the most acute risk of famine is, the UN says. And it's also where we see those images of the airdrops of the aid being delivered by cargo plane. And that's been horrific in some regards as well. It's crushed people.